Welcome! This video explains how the United States acquired all of its vast territory that now comprises the continental United States. Now, we're all familiar with the shape of the perimeter of the United States, but did you ever wonder, how did it get to be that way? In fact, if you think about it, the United States as a nation has only been around for some 200 years. That's like very recent. That's like a baby. The land has been around a lot longer than that. So it kind of makes you wonder, wait a second here. Who owned this land before the United States came along? And actually, the United States began as 13 colonies. So how did the United States acquire all of this vast territory from coast to coast? And it turns out that it is a fascinating story. And that is what this video is about. We are going to do a big picture flyover, zooming through time and history to understand how things got to be the way they are today. So let's kick it off. Let's kick it off with Christopher Columbus. Okay, so Christopher Columbus, as the popular narrative goes, discovered America. And when was that? What year? Does anybody know? He sailed the ocean blue in 1492. It's like magic how that little jingle always enables me to remember that date. All right, so 1492, Columbus sets sail on his historic voyage. But why? Why did he do it? What were the forces that compelled him and Spain to undertake this extremely risky voyage? And the answer is China. What? China? What did China have to do with Christopher Columbus discovering America? And it turns out a lot. And it had to do with the China trade. So the China trade was the trade of goods between China and the Western European countries. So like Spain, Italy, France, England. And this trade had been going on for centuries. In fact, centuries before the birth of Christ, so BCE. So for over 1,000 years, these two separate worlds, really, these two regions had engaged in the trade of goods. And over the course of this time, trade routes developed, the most famous of which is called the Silk Road. And the reason it's called the Silk Road is because silk products were made in China and then transported over the Silk Road to the destination in Western Europe. This map shows the Silk Road. So over to the west is Europe, and over to the east is China, and the Silk Road is reflected in red. So what would happen is products that were made in China would make their way onto the Silk Road, and then they would be transported overland to the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea. This is a critically important area. So once at the shore, the products could be loaded onto ships. Actually, the blue lines represent shipping routes. So you can see how the land routes eventually connected to the shipping routes to facilitate the distribution of products. So the ships would then sail to commercial centers in Europe where the products would be unloaded and then distributed over land all around Europe. So there were a few commercial centers in Europe. One was Rome. Another was Venice, Italy. In fact, Venice was a huge center for this trade. They controlled a lot of this trade. So there were many merchants of Venice, hence the name of Shakespeare's play. So the key to this whole operation was that the products that were made in the East all had to make their way to this critically important region right here on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. So this region is critically important. It stood at the crossroads between the two worlds of Europe and China. It was the crossroads of trade between these two worlds. So today we refer to this area as the Middle East. And in fact, you can see this map shows why it's named the Middle East. So you have Europe to the west, China to the east, and this region is in the middle. Thus, the Middle East. And sometimes it's also referred to as the Near East. And that's because if you're in Europe and you want to travel to China, first you hit the Near East, and then if you keep going, you make it to the Far East. So, okay, so this operation is going along for over 1,000 years of these products making their way over the Silk Road to the eastern shores of the Mediterranean and then being shipped into Europe. But then something happens. And that is, in the year 1453, the city of Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Empire. So Constantinople is located right about here. And it's in modern-day Turkey, the country of Turkey. And today the name of the city is Istanbul, but back then the city was named Constantinople. So the Ottoman Empire takes over Constantinople, but not just the city. The Ottoman Empire also takes over this entire region. So they take over Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, this entire region right here. So this poses a huge problem for Europe. Why? Well, because now there is a potentially hostile regime, the Ottoman Empire, that controls this key region. This hostile regime controls the crossroads of trade. So the Ottoman Empire, this potentially hostile regime, could cut off trade between Europe and China. Or they could do some crazy stuff like imposing, high taxes and tariffs. They could really disrupt trade here between Europe and China. So this poses a big problem for Europe. So all these Western European countries are thinking to themselves, man, we cannot have our trade with China disrupted here. So they start thinking to themselves, what can we do about this? And they come to the conclusion that they need to find an alternate route to China. Okay? They need a different route to China that does not go through the Ottoman Empire. Okay? So this sets off a mad scramble for centuries of all these European countries trying to figure out another way to China. And some of them are saying let's sail north, and some of them let's sail south, and some people are saying let's find a new overland route. And then along comes our friend Christopher Columbus, and he says, let's sail west. Okay? Now, this was not his idea. This was not Columbus's idea. This idea had been out there, it had been kicking around for a few years. But Columbus championed this idea in part because he wanted to do it. Okay? So he's advocating for this idea. So the idea is that, look, if you are here in Western Europe and you want to get to China, which is east, you will normally head east, right? You'll head in the direction that you want to go in. But what Columbus says is, no, let's head west. All right? Let's head in the exact opposite direction that we want to go in. And the idea was, so it's a radical idea, but the idea is that since the world is round, and they all believed that the world was round at this point. Nobody believed that the world was flat anymore. Since the world is round, we can sail around the back of the world, seemingly going the wrong direction, but we'll sail around the back of the world and we will end up in our desired location. So that's the idea. So what Columbus was thinking is, so here's Western Europe and Spain, and here's where he's trying to get to, China. And what he was thinking is you sail west, you are going to come out right here and end up right where you want to be, in China. But what Columbus didn't understand is that there was an entire continent in the way. So if you sail west from Spain, you're not going to come out here in China, but in fact you are going to bump into America, the Americas. Now, he had no idea. In fact, none of these Western Europeans had any idea. And to them, in their world, nobody in the world had any idea that this continent existed. They thought that the world just consisted of this part. They had no idea that the American continent existed. And this is a pretty good map right here, because this showed basically what they believed at the time. So this map is from this guy Toscanelli, and it's dated in 1474, and this is 20 years before Columbus's voyage. So this reflects, Columbus likely would have seen this exact same map, and this likely reflects what Columbus's view of the world was, or something very similar. So here's what the map shows. It shows Spain is right here, And if you sail west from Spain, you will end up, this cafe, this is China. You will end up in China, and they thought this was Japan and these were the East Indies. So they thought if you sail west from Spain, you'll end up in China. Now this map is of course wrong, but the one thing that's interesting about this map is superimposed on the background in this light color is the actual correct geography. So you can see the America continent right here. So this is exactly what happened. And so when Columbus sailed west, instead of getting into China, what happened was he bumped into America. The other interesting thing about this map is it shows how close they actually thought China was. They thought China was basically in the same location that America is in. So heading west was a radical idea, not only because you're headed in the exact opposite direction of where you want to go, but also because you are headed directly out to sea, directly away from land and out to sea into the great unknown, right? Nobody had ever crossed this ocean before. So to look out on it and be willing to sail directly out into the unknown is, pretty remarkable. Also, navigation was a factor. So the way navigation was done back then was not to sail directly out to sea, but rather it was to sail along the coast. And that way you could keep your eye on land, you could spot landmarks, and that is how you could tell where you were. But if you were sailing directly out to sea and you don't see land for a long period of time, how would you know where you were? So this is what Columbus was facing. Now there's this navigational technique of looking at the stars and being able to navigate by looking at the stars, but this technology was just emerging. It was by no means a sure shot back then. So another thing was there was some popular sentiments at the time that we would view as rather humorous today. Like one was, once you got out into the great depths of the ocean, there would be these great sea monsters that would come up and swallow you up. And another one was, if you sailed out far enough into the ocean, you would not be able to sail back. Okay, it's like you'd reach a point of no return and you would not be able to get back. So I'm sure that was on Columbus's mind as well. And also his boats, the ships that he had are amazing. They're just wooden ships that were not very big. You look at them today and you marvel that these things were even seaworthy. So this was a risky venture. In fact, a lot of these ships were lost at sea. So it was, this whole undertaking of Columbus really was amazing, to sail west across the ocean. It was risky and it took a lot of courage for him to do it. But he really wanted to do it. He was gung-ho and he kept at it. So he tried to convince these European countries to back his voyage because he needed some sponsorship in order to raise the money for this voyage. But he couldn't do it. Nobody would back him. So he went to Portugal, a couple times. He even returned to Portugal. The monarchs in Portugal went to the monarchs in Spain. They all said no. They all rejected him. He inquired with Italy and England. They all said no. And it's sort of an inspiration, actually, because it just shows you if you have a dream and you really want to do something, you might have to keep at it for a long time. And Columbus was at this for years trying to convince these countries to back him. But if you keep at it and you really believe in it, then you might be able to make it happen. Actually, another funny thing about this is that Columbus was just flat wrong. He was wrong about a few things, but one of the things he was wrong about too was his calculations as to how far it would be to China from Europe. And this all depends on, remember, he's sailing around the world, so it all depends on how big the world is, how big is the globe. And he totally miscalculated. He totally thought the globe was much smaller than it actually is. And this is one of the reasons why he kept getting rejected from these countries, because he would submit his proposal. The royal scientists at these various countries would look at his proposal and he'd say, the guy's just making mistakes here on his calculations. He's just wrong, so we're not going to back this guy who's just wrong. So that's actually a little bit inspirational as well, because if you have a dream, you have to keep at it. Even if nobody believes you, you've got to keep at it. But also, you could even still be wrong, and you can still make it a success. So Columbus finally convinces Spain, the monarchs of Spain, to back his voyage. So in 1492, Columbus leaves from Spain on his historic voyage. This is the route that Columbus took. So here's Spain up here. He leaves from Spain. He heads south down along the African coast. Actually, this is how navigation was done. You'd sail along the coast. So he comes to the Canary Islands. He hangs out there for a couple weeks. Then he heads out into the great beyond and crosses the Atlantic Ocean. And this takes him 5 weeks. He is at sea for 5 weeks before he lands in the Bahamas. And you can see this is the United States here, this is Florida, the southern tip of Florida, and these are the Bahamas. So he lands in the Bahamas on October 12th, 1492. And this is a closer view of the Bahamas. You can see the southern tip of Florida coming down here, and here are the Bahamas. And Columbus lands at this little island right here that he named San Salvador Island, and it's still named San Salvador Island today. So Columbus kind of hangs out here for a while. He cruises around some of these islands here. He comes down to Cuba. He checks out Cuba. He comes over here, checks out Haiti. He actually establishes a settlement in Haiti. So Columbus was actually in the area for a few months. He actually spent the winter in the Bahamas. He was no dummy. He knows a good place to spend the winter. And then in the following spring, so the spring of 1493, Columbus sets off on his return venture, and he sails back across the Atlantic Ocean and returns to Spain. So when Columbus landed in the Bahamas, he didn't know he was in the Bahamas. He didn't know that he had just discovered America. He thought he was in China. Now remember, this was the purpose of his trip. The purpose of his trip was not to try to discover America or discover any new lands. The purpose of his trip was to get to China. It was to discover a new route to China by sailing west. So when he hit land, he said to himself, ta-da! I'm successful. I've just landed in China. I knew I was right. Now, he didn't think he was on the mainland China. He knew he was in the islands, but he thought that he was in the islands that are just off of China. So these are the Indies. So Columbus thought he had just landed in the Indies right off of China. So here are the Indies right here. And this is where Columbus had thought he landed. So this is China here. So he thought he was close to China, and here is Western Europe, and here's Spain. So Columbus sailed from Spain westward, so he sailed this way. He didn't know anything about this continent, so he thought he'd come out here and he had landed here in the Indies. So when Columbus returned to Europe, so when he sailed back from the Bahamas and returned to Spain, he announced that he had just been in the Indies, right? Because he thought he was over here. In fact, he never was. He was over here. But people in Europe started referring to where Columbus had been as he had been in the Indies. So years later, when they figured out that, wait a minute, he wasn't in the Indies at all, he was over here in this new land, they said, well, we've been calling where Columbus was the Indies. What should we call it now that we know it's not the Indies? And they said, you know what, let's just call it the West Indies, okay? Which absolutely made no sense at all, because the reason that these islands are called the Indies is because they were the influence of India, which is right here. India is right here. Right? So it's India, the Indies, that's why they're called the Indies. But here, these islands had never had anything to do with India. So to call them the West Indies was just silly. And in fact, these islands now needed to be renamed. These islands had to be called the East Indies instead of just the Indies in order to distinguish them from the West Indies. And that is what they're called today. These are today called the East Indies and the West Indies. But this name that makes no sense was just a consequence of Columbus's mistake. Pretty funny. Another mistake that Columbus made was with respect to the indigenous people, the natives that he encountered. So because Columbus thought he was in the Indies, he named these people Indians. Okay? And this name stuck even through the United States. You know, the Native Americans have been called Indians. Even to this day, they're called Indians. But this name makes absolutely no sense because these people have nothing to do with India. Nothing to do with the Indies. It's just another consequence of Columbus's mistake. It's pretty funny. Another peculiar thing is that, you know, it's a sort of a common notion that Columbus discovered America, and America the country, like the United States territory. But the reality is that Columbus never set foot in America the country, or the territory that is now the United States. So on Columbus's initial voyage, Columbus landed in the Bahamas, and on this and subsequent voyages, he ended up checking out this area and the islands in Central America and South America, but Columbus himself never went north. So he never set foot on North America or on soil that is now the United States. In fact, not only did Columbus never set foot in the United States, but Columbus never even knew it existed. Now, eventually, the Spaniards did go north and discover North America when they landed on the east coast of Florida, but that didn't occur until 21 years after Columbus's initial voyage, which was 7 years after Columbus had already died. When Columbus returned to Spain after his first voyage, he met with the king and queen of Spain so he could report back to them on his adventure. So Columbus regaled them with tales of this land. He brought back treasure and gold for them that he had, taken with him. And he also showed them some native people that he had taken captive while he was there, brought them back to Spain and presented them in front of the court so he could show everybody what these native people looked like, which made quite an impression. So the purpose of Columbus here was he was trying to convince the Spanish crown to continue financing further expeditions. And Columbus hit a home run on this one because the Spanish crown was all in. They decided, absolutely, we're going in on this. We are going to finance a bunch more expeditions. So Columbus himself returned 3 more times, so he made 4 voyages in total. But it wasn't just him. They were sending all sorts of explorers, people to build forts and settlements and expand their footprint in the area. And in fact, it wasn't only Spain. This kicked off a whole era of exploration that lasted for centuries, of not just Spain, but other countries in Western Europe who also were sending expeditions across the Atlantic Ocean to this new world to explore, colonize, but also exploit this new world. But right now, when Columbus came back, we didn't know it was a new world yet because Columbus was insisting that he had just been in the Indies just off of China. So that's what people thought initially. But people sort of became skeptical that, wait a minute, this doesn't seem like it really was China and the Indies. And then as more information kept coming back from other explorations and whatnot, people, the evidence mounted pretty significantly that in fact, no, Columbus was not in the Indies just off of China. But Columbus himself insisted to his dying day, which was in 1506, so 14 years after his initial voyage, he insisted that no, this was not a new world, that he had discovered what he was looking for, which was the passage to China, and that he was in the Indies just off of China. But there was another guy by the name of Amerigo Vespucci. And Amerigo goes over and he does some exploration, and he comes back and he writes these accounts of what it was like. And these accounts become very popular because he describes this new land and these new peoples and all this. But he also makes the case in this account that nope, this was not China, it's not the Indies, but in fact, it is a new world. So as a result of these accounts, people start calling this new place America, after Amerigo Vespucci, the guy who wrote these accounts. So it's sort of a little twist of history that even though Columbus discovered America, America was not named after Columbus. So it turns out that, in fact, it was confirmed that it was a new land, that it was not China, that Columbus was wrong. And it was confirmed in 1513, so this was, a number of years after Columbus had already died in 1506. It was confirmed by another explorer who crossed the Isthmus of Panama, the thin little strip Panama, sort of like by the Panama Canal. And when he got to the other side of Panama, he didn't find China. What he found was an entirely new ocean, the Pacific Ocean. So since this was a new ocean, that confirmed it wasn't China, and thus it confirmed that this was a new land, a new continent here, the Americas. So Spain continues to send all of these additional explorers over to the New World to continue colonizing and building the settlements and expanding their footprint. And there are a number of these expeditions that you can read about. A lot of them are very interesting, but there is one expedition in particular that is truly extraordinary. And the reason it's so amazing is two reasons. One is just for the story itself of what happened on this expedition, which is incredible, but also for the tremendous significance to nothing less than world history and humankind. And that was the expedition of Hernán Cortés in 1519. Cortés was born in Spain to lower nobility. So he doesn't feel like he has huge potential to become super rich in Spain. So he decides to seek his fame and fortune in the New World. So he jumps on a ship and he sails over to the New World, and he helps Spain establish some settlements. He ends up on the island of Cuba. He helps establish a settlement there, and he actually becomes pretty prominent on the island of Cuba. But then history comes knocking, and he has the opportunity to lead an expedition from the island of Cuba over to the mainland, which is modern-day Mexico. This shows the route of Cortés's expedition. So you can see up here is the United States, here is Florida, here is Mexico, and here is the island of Cuba. This is where they started from. So Cortés's expedition sets sail from Cuba here and heads west towards Mexico. And they head towards the Yucatan Peninsula. They stop at the island of Cozumel, which is a popular tourist destination today. And then they continue around the Yucatan Peninsula, and they sort of sail around the coast of Mexico here, and they stop at various locations along the way. And they are certainly looking for gold, which is a big theme of Cortés. And they're looking for, what are the physical features of the land? What are the people like? Are the people hostile, friendly? Can we make alliances? That sort of thing. Doing what explorers do. So one amazing aspect of this story was that one of Cortés's soldiers was actually a talented writer, like a journalist. Now, he was not along on this expedition for that purpose. He was along on this expedition as a soldier and a swordsman, but it just so happened to be that he had this natural talent and natural ability. So after the expedition, he ended up writing a book all about this expedition. This was in the early 1500s, and this account has survived down through the ages, and we still have it today. It is an amazing sort of freak of history that we have a first-hand account of this historic expedition. I mean, it is, this expedition is, number one, the expedition of itself was amazing, but also it represents the meeting of the old world of, Europeans first encountering the new world of these native indigenous people. And it is just amazing to have a first-hand account of this story. So the name of the book is The Conquest of New Spain, and the soldier author who wrote it is Bernal Diaz. I would highly recommend the book, although I would give a parental warning because this expedition was pretty harsh. I mean, there were a lot of battles and, human sacrifices, and there's a lot of sort of adult material content here. But that's one of the things that makes the book so great, is that it tells it like it was, and a lot of that is pretty harsh. So, but it is a great book. In fact, it always makes these lists of the most important books in world history. So it's amazing. I would highly recommend it. So, and it's also a freak of history that we have this book from the 1500s, and that this guy survived. He was a soldier, that he wasn't killed. So the expedition is going along the coast, and they're stopping at various locations, and visiting various villages, and exploring and learning and meeting the people and all that. Some of them are friendly, some of them are hostile. In one of these villages, they end up getting into a battle. The conquistadors prevail in the battle, so this native tribe lost the battle. And as a tribute, they gave to the conquistadors 20 young women, girls, like teenagers, I think is what they were, and to use as slaves. Okay, now, I stop and I always marvel at that story just in and of itself. And it's actually a good example of the kinds of anecdotes that are in this book, that, read this book, you really get a sense of what life was like then. I mean, that is such a harsh thing. I mean, imagine if you're one of these girls who, you're a teenager and all of a sudden your village gives you over to these barbarian conquerors who just killed a bunch of people in your village, and you are given over as a slave and a sexual object. I mean, what a horrible prospect. And imagine if you're their parents, right? The parents have to give their own daughter up to, for a slave. I mean, it's just horrible, but it is a realistic account of what happened back then. So the conquistadors take these 20 slave girls, and as it turns out, in another freak of history on this story, one of these slave girls is actually remarkable. She has an incredible facility for languages. She speaks several dialects of these, various tribes in the area. So immediately, she is of great value to these conquistadors, right? So, but it's not only that. She is also wise. She's wise beyond her years, and she ends up being almost like a senior advisor to Cortez himself. And in fact, eventually, Cortez and she end up having a love relationship, and they have a son together. Okay, but that's down the road. Right now, she becomes this important person to this expedition, and all the men on the expedition recognize this as well. They respect her, and in fact, it is very likely the case that these men would not have survived without her. Her name was La Malinche. So Malinche was critical to the survival of this expedition. It's amazing. All right, so they're going down the shoreline. They're stopping at these various places, and they end up fighting some battles. And one incredible thing also is, how did these people survive, these conquistadors? They were just a small group. Cortez left with 500 men. That's it, right? And they're in this entire country of Mexico with, hundreds of thousands of, the population with, numerous warriors. How did they survive? It is an incredible story. And there were a number of reasons for this. One of them was that they had superior weaponry, superior technology, and that was basically steel, right? So they were conquistadors. So conquistadors is Spanish for conquerors. And Cortez, Hernan Cortez is one of the leading conquistadors in history, and this expedition was one of the leading conquistador expeditions. So they were Spanish soldiers, so they had these steel swords, they had steel shields, steel armor, steel spears. So that in itself was a big factor. They had guns, not a lot of guns, but they had guns. They had these sort of primitive sort of musket rifles. They had a few cannons, right? So these Native Americans had never seen anything like this. They hadn't seen steel before, or steel weapons, certainly hadn't seen guns. The other thing they had was they had crossbows, but the other thing that they had was the Europeans introduced horses to the New World. So the New World did not have horses at this time. So the Native Americans had never seen horses ever. So all of a sudden, these people, they see these people mounted on horses. In fact, some of the early sightings of when the Native Americans just saw, a conquistador mounted on a horse, they didn't realize that it was two separate beings. They thought it was one being, right? They referred to them as, men with two heads, meaning, one head was the human head and the other head was the horse head, and it was one being. So, and after they realized that it was, two beings, that a man was mounted on a horse, even, then they viewed these horses as like dragons. These horses were huge and fierce, particularly in battle. So that was another thing that was just amazing. So they certainly had superior technology. That was one of the reasons why they were able to survive. Another reason they were able to survive was Cortez was a master politician statesman slash manipulator. I mean, he was certainly not, wedded to being ethical in any respect. I mean, he was, manipulating people and playing people off each other and lying, telling different things to, different people, that kind of thing. But nonetheless, he was skilled at putting together various alliances between the conquistadors and various of these tribes. That was another factor that enabled them to survive. And another factor, which is just incredible, another incredible twist of fate in this story, had to do with religion. So the religion of these people was that they believed in this, huge, powerful god named Quetzalcoatl. And the story was that Quetzalcoatl in ancient times had left humanity and sailed off into the ocean to the east. But when the god Quetzalcoatl sailed off, he said, "I will return, and I will return the same way that I've sailed off here." And they had this ancient calendar. So these Native Americans had these ancient calendar that predicted the dates as to when Quetzalcoatl would return in the future. And out of a total freak of nature, Cortez's expedition just so happened to arrive in Mexico on the same date that this god Quetzalcoatl was supposed to return to Mexico. Okay, now imagine, you think this god is going to return, right? Okay, so Cortez arrives on the same date as this god, and then he arrives from the same area, the same sea, the same area that this god is supposed to arrive from the sea, from the east, and he's got all these things. I mean, he's got these these horses, these beings that they've never seen before, these guns. They call them sticks that shoot fire. I mean, steel. It's like crazy. So these people think that the conquistadors are gods. And there was a description of Quetzalcoatl of having a light face. When he returns, he will have a light face, a pale face, and a beard. And Cortez had a pale face because he was Spanish and a beard. So, these natives were thinking that, this is Quetzalcoatl's return. These are gods. This played a factor in their survival as well, because there were a number of instances where, these conquistadors were surrounded by these natives. These natives could have very easily wiped them out, but they were reluctant. They were reluctant to kill these conquistadors lest they be gods. They didn't want to, anger and kill these gods. So that was another, just amazing, freak of history. And Cortez had no idea about this. In fact, it was funny because, as they were going to these, various villages, village after village, these people would come out to them and greet them with, food and festivities and treasures and all that. And, the conquistadors are kind of looking at each other going, wow, these are really nice people. It turns out these people thought they were gods and they wanted to, pay tribute to the gods. So it's just an amazing, amazing twist of history again that enabled this small group of conquistadors who were vastly outnumbered to survive in this. All right, so they continue on their journey. They're cruising around along the shoreline and hitting various cities and exploring the territory. And as they explored, they kept hearing. So every place they went, they would always ask, "Where's the gold? Okay, do you have gold? Give me the gold. Give me the gold. Where's more gold?" All that. Cortez. That's really what Cortez was about. Is gaining riches. So. What they kept hearing, what these conquistadors kept hearing was, "Oh, you want gold? Oh, well, there's this great city way off. That's where you want to go if you want gold, because this great city is full of riches. That's where the riches are." And Malinche, the teenage girl translator, she also described this city to Cortez. So again and again and again, they keep hearing, "Oh, you want to go to this great city." And the name of the city was Tenochtitlan, which today is Mexico City. And they're hearing about these great people and all that. And we know today it was the Aztec Empire. This is the great Aztec Empire. But Cortez and these guys had no idea what that was the Aztec Empire. They're just hearing, "Oh yeah, there's this great city." So they continue on their journey. They're sailing up the shore. They get to Veracruz, which is a location on the shore. They conquer Veracruz. They establish a camp. And Cortez says, "You know what? We've got to go to this great city. That's what we've got to do. That's our next move." Now, the significance of going to this great city meant that they would have to leave the safety of the shoreline. So up till now, they've been sailing along the shore. But in order to get to this great city, Tenochtitlan, they had to go inland. So they're camped out right here at Veracruz, and they've come along the shore. So far their journey had been along the shore, right? They left Cuba here, and then they've been traveling all along the shore of Mexico, and they end up camped at Veracruz. And this is where Cortez says, you know what? We've got to go to Tenochtitlan, where all the riches are. So that means they would head inland on this journey. It's maybe hard to see. It's a white line here. Inland on the journey to Mexico City, which is in the heart of Mexico. Here's a closer look of it. So here's the coast where they were camped at Veracruz, and here is Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, where Cortez wanted to go for all the riches. So you can see their route here is, it's kind of a circuitous route, and it is not an easy route with considerable distance. Cortez's men, however, do not want to go inland. They are like, no, 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 no. No means no, Cortez. Read my lips. No new incursions. So the reason they don't want to go inland is because they're leaving the safety of their ships and the safety of their shore, right? Plus, they're this small little contingent here of conquistadors, and by traveling all these miles inland, it's crazy. They are going to be surrounded by all these natives. They're going to be vastly outnumbered. They just think it's like a death sentence, and they've been, fighting all these battles now for a long time. They just want to go home. So the mutiny is sort of in the air, and what the men are, sort of semi-openly saying is they're just going to get on the ships and they are going to sail back to Cuba. They want to go home, okay? So what does Cortez do? Cortez burns the ships. He lights the ships on fire. He burns his own ships, okay? It reminds me of that scene in the movie Jaws when, Chief Brody runs to the radio and he starts, attempting to do a mayday call on the radio, and Quint comes over with a club and smashes the radio to pieces. Watching that movie, you're like, oh my gosh, they just got rid of the radio. The radio was their one lifeline, their one connection to shore where they could call for help. Without the radio, they're screwed. Same here with Cortez. Cortez burns his own ships. They are now stranded. They can't get on these ships and, for safety or even sail away. They're stuck on the beach here. So now the men have little choice because they can't just sit on the beach. They're sitting ducks. They're targets. They will eventually be attacked if they sit on the beach. So the plot works. The men agree, maybe not happily, but they agree to follow Cortez. So off they go, heading inland toward Tenochtitlan. So along the way, they encounter these various tribes, and they learn that not all of these tribes are aligned with the Aztec Empire. In fact, some of these tribes hate the Aztec Empire. And the reason is because the Aztec Empire is acting like empires tend to act, and they are subjugating these people out in the region. So they're taxing them by forcing them to pay tribute back to the Tenochtitlan, the headquarters, and they are subjugating the people, and they're taking some of the people as slaves. So a number of these villages are actually, they hate the Aztec Empire, and some of them are actually at war with the Aztec Empire. So this is where Cortez works his little political magic. So he realizes these divisions and he exploits them. So what he tells some of these people who don't like the Aztec Empire is he says, oh yeah, that's horrible that they do that to you. Why don't you join us, give us a bunch of warriors, and we'll topple the Aztec empires, and then we'll set you free. While at the same time, Cortez is sending messages to the Aztec Empire saying, oh, we're your friend, and all that. So this is where his political games come in. So they continue the march to the capital city, Tenochtitlan, and all of a sudden they arrive at and see the city for the first time. And these conquistadors are awed. They are amazed. The city is magnificent. It is huge. It is larger than anything that they have seen in Europe. It's like twice the size of London, twice the size of Rome. It's huge. And it has this magnificent, architecture of these temples. It's clean because they have this incredible refuse system. The market is amazing with all these goods being traded. They are astonished. So they make their way to the king of the Aztec Empire, which is Montezuma. Montezuma receives them in his palace. In fact, Montezuma has a huge palace, like empires tend to do. And Montezuma puts them up. Cortez and all his men puts them up in basically the palace complex, and things start out fine. Everybody's playing nice with each other. In fact, they sort of take a tour around the city and all that. Everything's fine. But pretty soon, things start to disintegrate. So Cortez starts to suspect that Montezuma is kind of like Cortez in that he's a political operative, and that perhaps Montezuma has been playing Cortez. And if that's the case, then what Montezuma has done is drawn Cortez into the center of this city, where he is basically surrounded and trapped and has little hope of surviving if Montezuma turns on him. So Cortez is feeling like he has been played and he's in a corner. So what does Cortez do? He seizes Montezuma and takes Montezuma hostage. Okay? He takes him hostage in his own palace. But he doesn't tell anybody. And he tells Montezuma, you tell everybody, all your senior people and all your people, that everything's cool. You tell them that the conquistadors, everything's cool, everything's fine. But if you don't, then no more for you, right? So this actually works for a while. So Montezuma is almost like a puppet, right? Montezuma's telling everything, no, everything's fine, the conquistadors, it's all cool, okay? So this works for a little while, but things continue to disintegrate. So Cortez is off doing something else, and some of Cortez's men in a different area of the palace, they start to get paranoid that they are about to be attacked by some of these Aztec people. So in order to preempt that, they launch an attack first. So the conquistadors end up killing a bunch of Aztec people, including like religious people and musicians and people who were unarmed. Well, this creates all sorts of problems, because now this actually gets out into the population that the conquistadors have killed these people and engaged in this sort of massacre. So now the people of the city start to get restless, and they start to gather, and they're starting to protest and become, they're up in arms here. So Cortez is getting worried here. So what does Cortez do? He tries to continue this little scheme of having Montezuma as his puppet. So he basically pushes Montezuma out into the, this open area to speak to all the people. And Montezuma tells all the people, don't worry, everything's fine. Everybody calm down. It's all cool. With the conquistadors, it's all cool. But this time, it doesn't work. The people don't buy it. They're still upset. They're still demonstrating. And in fact, they're throwing all these rocks and stones, and they're yelling and screaming, and things are beginning to be more hostile. So Cortez pulls Montezuma back. And Montezuma then, while in the custody of the conquistadors, dies. Okay. Now, how he dies is a matter of great contention in Mexico. There's two versions. The versions from the conquistadors is that when Montezuma was out speaking to his people and they were protesting and throwing all those stones, one of the stones thrown by the people hit Montezuma in the head, and that ended up causing Montezuma's death a little while after that. So the conquistadors said basically Montezuma was killed by his own people, even if accidentally. The Aztecs, however, have a different version. Their version is that the conquistadors murdered Montezuma. So when the conquistadors saw that this scheme was no longer working as Montezuma as the puppet, they concluded that Montezuma is no longer any use for us, so they murdered him in cold blood. What the truth is, we will never know. However, what this left for Cortez is still trapped in the palace. He's got this angry mob, huge mob, lining up against him, and he no longer has Montezuma as his hostage. So he is in trouble. So what do? They make a run for it. Okay. Now this is huge because there's whatever 1,000 people, 1,000 of the conquistadors, but there's the city of Tenochtitlan was like 250,000 people. So there's whatever tens of thousands of warriors, and they're all lined up. And here you've got Cortez and his men making a run for it. So it turns into a huge battle that is extremely bloody with huge casualties on both sides. Many of the conquistadors died, many of the Aztec died. But Cortez somehow, miraculously, makes it out. Him and his number of his senior people make it out. Okay, so they make it back to their camp at Veracruz, and they call in reinforcements. And this event, the killing of Montezuma and this battle at Tenochtitlan, end up starting a war between the conquistadors and the Aztecs. And it really represents sort of a larger war between the old world of Europe coming in and starting a war with the new world of the indigenous peoples. So what ends up happening in the war? Well, it takes a long time, because what Cortez's strategy is his strategy is to basically cut off Tenochtitlan. And he does that by eventually surrounding the city, cutting them off from supplies, and basically, strangling them over time. So this takes another 1.5 to 2 years, but eventually Tenochtitlan does fall. So Cortez and his men ride in to Tenochtitlan and take over. The Aztec Empire falls, it ceases to exist, and Cortez becomes the governor of Mexico. So is Cortez a hero or a villain? Well, that is certainly a controversial question, but it seems that he was both, actually. I mean, from one perspective, he was certainly a hero in that it was a military victory. I mean, it was amazing how such a small force was able to defeat such a tremendously large nation. So that was a victory from that perspective. Also, from Spain's perspective, this increased Spain's territory, and it increased their treasure, certainly for the Spanish crown. So from Spain's perspective, it was a huge victory, and Cortez was a huge hero, and in fact, he was viewed that way by Spain back then. On the other hand, viewing it through the perspective of modern day today, this would never be tolerated. This would be viewed as a horrible thing if one country invaded another country. So from that perspective, Cortez is certainly not a hero, and the consequences of the conquest were basically to stamp out the entire Aztec culture, which was a rich culture. So that is lost to history. So from that perspective, Cortez is not a hero, but in fact is more of a villain. So, but regardless of whether you like it or hate it, one thing that is absolutely true is that this was an enormously significant event in world history. Both the conquest of Cortez into New Spain, but also Columbus coming to America. And the reason is, you think about it, you had these two separate cultures. You had the European culture and the American cultures that previously had been separated by an entire ocean. They didn't share anything. But with crossing the Atlantic Ocean for the first time, these two cultures are sharing all sorts of things, and that had enormous impact on ecology and biology and diseases and foods. They exchanged all sorts of stuff. Actually, it's known as the Columbian Exchange. The Europeans introduced things into the New World like cattle and horses and sheep. These things did not exist in the New World at that time, and the New World introduced a number of things into Europe like tobacco and corn and potatoes and tomatoes and chocolate and vanilla and all sorts of stuff. So it changed the world. In fact, in many scientific disciplines, there is a bright line between pre-Columbian and after, because pre-Columbian meaning before Columbus's voyage, because once these two people started to mix, it changed everything. So what happened to Spain? So Spain continued on their march towards colonialization. So they kept sending more and more people, more and more expeditions. They kept, exploring more and more territory and taking over more and more territory. So they expanded their footprint and they expanded their empire. This reflects the extent of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, which is truly extraordinary. So let's take a closer look at our region. So here you can see what is today the United States. This is Mexico, this is Cuba, and Haiti. So in 1492, Columbus crossed the Atlantic Ocean and landed in the Bahamas here. Spain then spread their colonies to Haiti and then Cuba. And then 30 years later, Cortez had his historic expedition. So Cortez left from Cuba, went to the Yucatan Peninsula, sailed along the shore here, stopped at Veracruz, set up camp, and then from Veracruz went inland to Tenochtitlan and conquered that city, which was the capital of the Aztec Empire and culture. And when Cortez captured that city, he renamed it Mexico City, which is still named today. And in fact, Mexico City then served as Spain's capital and headquarters for their empire in this region. And in fact, it's, the language of Mexico today is Spanish. It is not the language of the Aztecs, and same with religion. The religion of Mexico today is Catholicism. It is not the religion of the Aztecs, and this is all a result of Cortez and the Spanish conquistadors here. So Spain then expanded out from Mexico City and moved northward, pretty soon crossed into territory that is now the United States. So Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. And you can see how far they came up, all the way to the northern boundary of California. So Los Angeles would be about right here. San Francisco would be about right here, but Spain came all the way up to here. And the reason that this is offset here in a different color is because Spain actually claimed this territory as well, the Oregon Territory, which is Oregon and Washington. But Spain never really consolidated their ownership of it, and that's why it's offset in a different color. That's why it's not red. So then Spain acquired all of this territory as well in the United States. And Florida was a long-time bastion of Spanish territory. So very early on, the Spaniards mostly moved this way, but very early on, they also went north. They landed on the east coast of Florida, and they founded Florida, actually, and they established Florida early on as a stronghold of the Spanish Empire. So this is truly extraordinary to see how much territory Spain owned in what is today the United States.